Welcome to Chess Dog. Today we have a game between two of the best players in the world. Alireza Firouzja is taking on one of India's best young talented players, Nihal Sarin. This is a Blitz game played on chess.com. 3 minutes for each side. Nihal Sarin has white. Alireza Firouzja has black. This is a fun game. I think you're going to enjoy it. Let's jump right in. Sarin begins with d4. Firouzja plays g6, the modern system. And now e4 is played. So we have a sort of a mainline modern defense with e4, bishop g7, knight f3, d6. And here Nihal Sarin plays bishop to c4, placing the bishop aggressively, aiming at the f7 square, knight to f6, and queen to e2. Not only does this defend e4, but it also prepares the e5 push. He wants to kick this knight on f6 away from the king side to make attacking easier. Castles, e5, just as we said, pawn takes, and knight to d5. So Firouzja wants to create sort of a strong point for this knight at d5 to block the activity of this c4 bishop. After h3, keeping the bishop out of g4, Firouzja plays c6, defending the knight at d5. Castles and bishop to e6 was played. After queen c7, trying to apply pressure to the e5 pawn, rook e1, and white stays a little bit better here. Bishop e6 blocks the pawn, defends the knight. Rook to d1, placing the rook opposite the queen. Knight to d7 blocks that, but also applies more pressure to the e5 pawn. That's a key pawn. White wants that pawn there for space and attacking potential, but it is also vulnerable to attack itself, so a lot of pressure builds around e5. The bishop goes to b3. That clears a way for the c pawn to advance to c4, kicking the knight away at some point if need be. Queen to c7, again attacking the pawn 3 times. It's only defended twice, so white defends it a 3rd time with rook to e1. And now a5. The idea from Firouzja is to play a4, kick this b3 bishop away, and get it just really irritated and get some space on the queen side. So a4 was played by Sarin to prevent that maneuver. The problem, of course, is that leaves some weak squares in white's position, and Firouzja pops in with knight to c5, a very thematic idea, putting some pressure on a4. He can't capture it. It's defended by the rook, as well as the bishop, but mainly applying pressure to the bishop at b3. That's a very important piece for white, and he does not want to part with it. So Nihal Sarin moves the bishop to c4, saving it. Rook a to d8, putting the rook on the one open file in the position. And here, the best move for Nihal Sarin probably was knight b to d2. The one downside of that move is it allows this move knight to f4 because it blocks the bishop's access to the f4 square, and the knight hits the queen. However, after queen to e3, Sarin would hit the knight at f4 as well as the knight at c5. And after bishop takes, knight takes bishop, and then the knight goes back to e6, defending the other knight. White seems to have a slight advantage here, but it's very nip and tuck. But instead, white plays the move knight to c3. That does directly attack this knight and get it off of the board. The problem is, after Firouzja plays knight takes c3, which he does, only the pawn can recapture. And now there are a lot of weaknesses on the queen side for white. After bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, knight to e6, you sort of get the middle game we're going to be looking at. And the pawn at e5, again, is vitally important. It's attacked, but it also controls key squares. But these pawns on the queen side are bad for white. Now, if you put this in the computer, it actually prefers white slightly. But I can't say I'm sure why. It looks to me like certainly long-term, black has the edge here. Nihal Sarin shifts his queen over to the king side, preparing the idea of bishop to h6. If the knight were to leave e6, then this knight could jump into g5 also, and he would have quite a potent attack. Firouzja plays rook to d5, centralizing the rook, applying more pressure to the e5 pawn, bishop to h6, offering to trade off that important defensive bishop at g7, rook f to d8, doubling on the one completely open file on the board, rook a to b1, applying pressure to the pawn at b7, and watch this. Watch what Firouzja does with this rook at d5. Watch how he uses it to maximum effect. He insists on putting it on the square where it puts the maximum pressure on white's position. It's really quite instructive to watch what he does with that rook. First, he plays rook to c5. So he's not only applying pressure to e5, he's also applying pressure to the c3 pawn, this newly weakened c3 pawn. Rook to e3, and now this rook is defending, but it's defending laterally, so it's not quite in a comfortable place. Bishop takes bishop, queen takes h6, and now rook to c4. So now the rook is in even better position. Not only is he attacking c3, but he's attacking the weak pawn at a4. Here, a reasonable attacking idea for white was to play h4, and maybe just not worry about this a pawn, and try to generate some counterplay on the king side with the knight and the rook and the queen. But instead he plays the move rook to d3. And this ends up being a mistake because it gives up a very valuable pawn. Rook takes d3, and now black wins material after he recaptures. Now rook c3. And Firouzja has won a pawn, and he's applying pressure to the d3 pawn, and there's still this weakness at a4. So Nihal Sarin brings his queen back, attacks the rook, defends the pawn at d3. The rook goes back to c5, keeping some pressure here. Queen to b2, going after this b7 pawn. So the only move, really obvious move here from Firouzja is b5. Pawn takes, and here he could take cb5 and keep these pawns intact, and that will be fine. But he decides instead to take with the rook, probably equally as good. The pawns are separated, but he gets more material off the board, and the endgame favors him being up a pawn. So queen a2 exchanges rooks, queen b1, and now a4. This pawn at a4 spells big trouble for white. It is not an easy pawn to stop. Queen to b4 from Nihal Sarin, and now queen to a7. And Firouzja is already threatening to push that pawn, and queen goes to a3. You know the old rule that knights make the best blockaders of passed pawns? Well, there's a corollary of that rule. Queens make the worst blockaders of passed pawns. You don't want your valuable queen busy blockading a pawn, but that is the position white finds himself in here. c5, and the idea is Firouzja can play queen a5, queen b4, and push that queen away and advance the pawn further. The knight goes to d2, but that gives up control of the d4 square, and Firouzja pops right in. He could still play queen a5 with the idea of queen to b4 still, but the knight goes to d4, knight to c4. That keeps the queen out of a5 for the moment, but then knight to b5 hits the queen, pushes away the blockader, and after queen a2, a3, the knight protects the pawn, the queen protects the pawn. If you put this in a computer, it gives black around +5, and in this position, Nihal Sarin resigned. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by clicking the thanks button below. And even after going over this great game from Alireza Firouzja, there's still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to watch is this game right here. You're going to love it.